brutally robbed and thrown into a deadly, inescapable desert canyon. A grieving daughter was left to rot by the corrupt men who stole her only inheritance. The ruthless town leaders gleefully believed her life was erased forever in that desolate wasteland. They had no idea this bone-dry prison secretly harbored a staggering hidden fortune and a blood-soaked conspiracy, and they never suspected it concealed the exact weapon she needed to expose their darkest crimes, dismantle their stolen empire, and orchestrate their absolute, undeniable ruin. The truth was waiting for her, buried under a decade of lies in a place everyone had dismissed as an ending. Settle in and let the dust of the high desert settle with you. This is a story about the things we throw away and the treasures they hold inside. The shove was brutally simple. A firm, calloused hand between her shoulder blades, a sudden loss of balance on the crumbling scree, and then a dizzying, scraping fall. Rosevale didn't scream. The breath was stolen from her lungs by the impact that sent a constellation of pain through her ribs. She tumbled, a tangle of calico and limbs coming to a rest against a slab of sun-baked sandstone that felt as hot as a stove door. Above, 3 silhouettes stood against the searing blue of the sky. One of them, a thick-set man named Silas Thorne, held the small leather wallet containing her father's papers. He didn't look down for long. He had what he wanted. The other 2, hired muscle with faces worn blank by indifference, simply turned and followed him. Their footsteps faded, leaving only the sound of a single dislodged pebble skittering down the slope. Then silence. A profound, absolute silence that was heavier than any sound. Rose lay still, listening to the frantic drumming in her ears. Dust filled her mouth, gritty and bitter. Slowly, she pushed herself up, ignoring the sharp protest from her side. She was in a box canyon, a deep gash in the earth, known locally as the Devil's Jaw. The walls were sheer, ruddy cliffs that offered no handholds, rising hundreds of feet to the narrow slit of sky. It was a natural prison, a place where lost cattle and foolish prospectors went to be rendered into bone and dust by the relentless sun. This was where they had left her, not just robbed, but discarded, an inconvenience to be disposed of, a memory of her father, his face etched with the hopeful exhaustion of a man who'd finally found his place, flashed in her mind. "It ain't much, Rosie," he told her, pressing the papers into her hand just a month before the fever took him. "But it's ours. It's a start." Now that start was in the pocket of the man who had just tried to murder her. The injustice of it was a cold, hard knot in her chest, colder even than the fear. She was alone, bruised, half-starved, and without a single drop of water. The sun beat down, a physical weight, and the canyon floor shimmered with heat. It was an ending. They had written her ending for her. But as she scanned the baked, cracked earth, her gaze caught on something impossible, a flicker of darker soil, a line of dampness no wider than her finger, disappearing into a jumble of fallen rock. It was nothing. It was everything. It was a trickle of water. Rose woke to a thirst so complete it felt like a living thing inside her, clawing at her throat. Her lips were cracked, her tongue a dry stone in her mouth. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the memory returned, sharp and brutal. The fall, the mocking faces, the crushing silence of the canyon. Despair washed over her, heavy and suffocating. She was going to die here. It was as simple as that. Her father's dream, her own small hope for a life rebuilt from ashes, would end as a scatter of bones bleached white under the Arizona sun. She closed her eyes, a single tear carving a clean path through the grime on her cheek. But then she remembered. The damp soil, the impossible hint of water. She forced her eyes open and pushed herself onto her hands and knees, the sharp rocks digging into her skin. There it was, a thin, dark line seeping from the base of a rock wall. It wasn't a stream, not even a trickle. It was just a slow, patient weeping of moisture from the deep stone, enough to dampen the dirt for a few feet before the sun drank it away. Everyone knew the Devil's Jaw was bone dry. It was a place of endings. But this single, dismissed fact, this tiny geological secret, refused to fit. It was a flaw in the story of her doom. Gritting her teeth against the fire in her ribs, she began to follow it. It was the only choice she had. The water led her not outward, but inward, deeper into the canyon's embrace, toward a massive rockfall that looked as if it had happened a lifetime ago. The dampness vanished beneath a colossal boulder. It was a dead end. The hope that had flickered within her died, and she slumped against the rock, defeated. But as her hand rested on the stone, she felt it. A faint, cool draft. Her gaze followed the feeling, tracing the nearly invisible seams where boulders lay against each other. Behind one low slab, almost completely hidden by scree and shadow, was a gap. A fissure no wider than her shoulders. The cool air, smelling of stone and deep earth, breathed from within. Driven by the last drags of her strength, she clawed away the loose rock and squeezed herself through the opening. She emerged not into a cave, but a passage, sloping gently downward into the dark. The trickle of water reappeared here, a silver thread on the stone floor, leading her on. After 50 feet, the passage opened into a chamber, and Rose stopped, her breath catching in her throat. In the faint light filtering from the passage behind her, she saw them. 3 heavy iron-banded chests, a stack of wooden crates, and several canvas-wrapped shapes leaning against the far wall. They were covered in a thick blanket of dust, undisturbed for years, perhaps decades. This was no natural cavern. It was a hideout, a secret place. She had stumbled out of one prison and into another. But this one held a different kind of secret, one that had been waiting in the cool, silent dark for someone to find it. What would you do if you found a secret that could save you, but also destroy a town? Is survival worth the cost of unearthing a generation of lies? Let us know in the comments what choice you would make, and be sure to subscribe for more stories from the Forgotten Frontier. Rosevale didn't know it yet, but the choice had already been made for her, the moment she followed that impossible trickle of water. The memory of the journey to the valley surfaced as she drifted in a feverish sleep days later, safe in a stranger's bed. She remembered the stagecoach leaving her in a dusty settlement that was little more than a saloon, a livery, and a general store. Before heading toward the land office in the larger town of Redemption, she'd walked to the edge of a dry creek bed, needing a moment to gather herself. An old prospector was there, sifting tirelessly through the gravel. He'd looked up as she approached, his eyes a startlingly pale blue in a face that was a road map of wrinkles. He glanced at her, then at the hard-baked earth around them, and then to the cloudless sky. His voice was like stones grinding together. "The driest ground," he'd said, not to her, but to the air itself, remembers the deepest water. He'd bent back to his work, and she had walked on, dismissing the words as the rambling of a sun-touched old man. Now, lying in the quiet cabin, the words echoed with the weight of prophecy. She had found the deep water in the driest ground. Later that day in her memory, she'd entered the Redemption Saloon, looking for the claims office. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of stale whiskey. Her question, spoken softly to the bartender, had drawn the attention of a table in the corner. Silas Thorne sat there, flanked by the same two men who would later throw her into the canyon. Thorne's laugh was loud and dismissive. "A claim? Little lady, the only thing a woman can claim in this valley is a husband." His men had chuckled. "That plot your daddy filed on ain't worth the paper it's written on. Barren rock and lizards." The public humiliation had stung, but it was the cold, possessive light in his eyes that she remembered most. He wasn't just mocking her. He was warning her. He already considered that land his. The memory faded, replaced by the reality of the quiet room. She was in a small, sparsely furnished cabin. A fire crackled low in the hearth. A man sat in a chair by the window, mending a piece of leather harness, his back to her. He was the one who had found her. He had carried her out of that canyon, his presence as silent and steady as the rock walls themselves. She had been here for days, drifting in and out of consciousness. He had cleaned her wounds, fed her broth, and asked for nothing. Now, fully awake for the first time, she watched him. His name was Eli Price, he told her in a low murmur during a moment of lucidity. His movements were spare and deliberate, weighted with a sorrow that seemed to have settled deep into his bones. He was her savior, but he was also a stranger. The cash, the ledgers, the whole explosive secret of the canyon was a dangerous burden to share. He must have felt her eyes on him, for he stopped his work and turned. His face was weathered, his gaze cautious. "You're awake," he said. It wasn't a question. He stood and came to the bedside, offering her a tin cup of water. She drank, the cool liquid a balm to her raw throat. He took the cup back, his expression unreadable. "What happened to you out there?" he asked, his voice even. The mockery of Thorne, the cryptic warning of the old prospector, the weight of the discovery in the cave, it all pressed down on her. She couldn't tell him everything. Not yet. But she couldn't lie. "I was robbed," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "My father's papers. A man named Thorne." Eli's face didn't change, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. He knew the name. That much was clear. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face, and he waited for the rest. Eli Price hadn't gone looking for trouble. Trouble, in his experience, always found you, and he'd had enough to last a lifetime. His days followed a simple, rigid pattern. Rise before dawn, check the fences, tend the stock, work until his muscles ached too much to feel anything else, and then sit in the quiet of the cabin. His wife had made a home, trying not to feel her absence in every corner. His small ranch sat on the desolate edge of the valley, pressed up against the Badlands, a place most folks avoided. He preferred it that way. Solitude was a balm for a wound that wouldn't heal. I was tracking a stray calf that had wandered toward the broken country near the Devil's Jaw, when his horse, Gideon, stopped dead. The old gelding, a companion as quiet and worn as Eli himself, lifted his head, ears pricked forward, and blew out a soft, uneasy breath. Eli followed the horse's gaze down into the chasm. At first he saw nothing but the familiar red rock and purple shadows, then a flicker of movement, a patch of faded blue calico against the rust-colored stone. A body. He expected to find a prospector who'd misjudged the heat. But as he made the treacherous descent, picking his way down a path only he and the wild sheep knew, the shape resolved itself into that of a woman. She was lying near a rock fall, looking as broken and discarded as a child's lost doll. He knelt beside her, his shadow falling across her face. She was young, her face bruised and smeared with dirt, her breathing shallow. She was alive. Barely, he unslung his canteen, uncorked it, and gently lifted her head. He let a few drops of water fall onto her cracked lips. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and clouded with pain. For a second, he saw not a stranger, but his own wife, Mary, in her last days. Her body failed by a fever. The town doctor had been too slow or too indifferent to treat. The memory was a physical blow. He couldn't save Mary, but he could not leave this woman to die. He poured more water, and she drank, a desperate animal thirst in the movement of her throat. He looked around the canyon, a place of grim legend. No one survived the jaw. Yet here she was, not near the entrance where she'd fallen, but deep within it, by a hidden spring he hadn't known existed. She had fought. She hadn't surrendered. A flicker of respect cut through his weariness. With a sigh that seemed to draw up all the grief and exhaustion of the past year, he stoppered his canteen. He gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed, all sharp angles and fragile bones. The climb back up was grueling. Gideon watched his careful progress, steady as a rock. He settled her onto the saddle, her head lolling against his chest as he mounted behind her and turned the horse for home. Her fate was now tangled with his, an unwelcome complication. Another stray he couldn't bring himself to abandon. He didn't know her name or her story, only that she was a piece of wreckage washed up on the shore of his quiet life. As they rode, the sun dipping below the canyon rim, painting the sky in hues of blood and gold, he felt the crumpled paper clutched in her hand, a secret she had held on to even in unconsciousness. Rose woke slowly, the world coming back to her in fragments. The scent of wood smoke and dried sage, the rough texture of a wool blanket, the low rhythmic sound of a man's breathing in the quiet of the room. She was in a bed, a real bed, soft and warm. Her body ached with a deep thrumming pain, but the sharp edges of it had been sanded down. She opened her eyes. The cabin was small and impeccably clean, a testament to a life of lonely order. A rifle rested on pegs over the stone fireplace. A small shelf held a handful of books. Through the single window, she could see a corral and a vast, empty expanse of land stretching to a distant mesa. For several days, this was her world. Eli Price moved around her with a quiet, almost ghostly efficiency. He would leave broth and bread by her bedside, refresh the water in the bucket, and then disappear for hours, his work on the ranch pulling him out into the sun. They existed in a shared silence, two people walled in by their own private griefs. He asked no questions, and she offered no answers. But the secret she carried was a living thing. In her fevered sleep, she murmured names. Thorn, she'd whisper, the name a curse on her tongue. Then later, ledgers and the stone. Eli, sitting by the fire, would hear these fragments, and his stillness would deepen. He knew Thorn, the man who owned the town of redemption, whose smile never reached his cold eyes. The man whose pocket doctor had assured him Mary's fever was nothing to worry about. The word ledgers was a hook that snagged on his own long-held unspoken suspicions about how Thorn had built his empire. One afternoon, when Rose was stronger, he found her sitting up, staring at the crumpled claim papers she'd insisted on keeping by her side. He saw the name Vale printed on the document. He remembered the whispers in town weeks ago of some dead prospector's daughter coming to claim a worthless patch of rock. The woman the whole valley was now certain had vanished into the desert. He pulled up a stool, his movements slow. "Silas Thorn," he said, his voice low and flat. "You said his name." Rose flinched, her hand tightening on the papers. She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time. His eyes were kind, she realized, but shadowed with a pain that she recognized. He was not a man who trusted easily. She had to give him a piece of the truth. "He took these from me," she said, her voice raspy. "He and his men, they left me in the canyon to die." Eli nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. He had already pieced that much together, but he could see in her eyes that it wasn't the whole story. There was something else, something she was holding back, something that had kept her alive when by all rights she should be dead. He waited. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire. Rose took a breath, the air still painful in her bruised lungs. This quiet, wounded man had saved her life. He deserved more than a half-truth. "He didn't just take my papers," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper, but clear as a bell in the still room. "There's something else. Something I found. A secret in the canyon." The decision to trust her was not a logical one. It was an instinct, a gut feeling that Eli Price had learned to heed in a life that offered few certainties. The mention of Thorn, coupled with the fierce, desperate intelligence in Rose's eyes, was enough. He had spent a year steeping in his own bitter solitude, watching Thorn's power grow, feeling the town's corruption like a sickness in the air. Rose's secret, whatever it was, felt like a possible antidote. "Show me," he said. And just like that, the wall between them crumbled. The next morning, they rode out together. Rose, still weak but resolute, sat astride a gentle mare while Eli led the way on Old Gideon. The labor of the journey was a silent communion. They moved through the starkly beautiful landscape, their shared purpose a tangible thing in the air between them. When they reached the Devil's Jaw, Eli tethered the horses in a hidden alcove. He led Rose to the rockfall, his rifle held loosely in his hand, his eyes scanning the canyon rims. She pointed to the fissure. "In there," he squeezed through the opening, a strange sense of unreality settling over him. He had known this canyon his whole life as a place of death. To find it held a secret chamber was like discovering a new room in his own house. He lit a lantern, the warm glow pushing back the ancient darkness. Rose followed him in, and her story became real. The chests, the crates, the dust of ages. With a crowbar from his saddlebag, Eli pried open the lid of the first chest. The lantern light caught the dull gleam of gold coins, a fortune. But Rose barely glanced at it. She went to a small tin box tucked away in a corner, its lid sealed with wax. "This," she said, her voice hushed. "This is what matters." They carried the box to a flat rock and broke the seal. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 2 thick leather-bound ledgers and a bundle of letters tied with twine. They spread the documents out, the flickering light making the spidery handwriting dance. The investigation began. It was the meticulous accounting of a ghost. The ledgers belonged to the Red Rock Gang, a band of outlaws who had terrorized the territory a decade ago before vanishing without a trace. Every robbery, every stolen payroll, every rustled herd was detailed with chilling precision. But as they turned the pages, a second, more sinister accounting came to light. Alongside the entries of stolen goods were notes on their dispersal. Names. The names of men in redemption, who had acted as fences, who had provided information, who had grown rich and powerful on the back of the gang's crimes. Eli's jaw tightened until it ached. He saw the name of the sheriff, the head of the town council, the doctor, the man who had patted his shoulder and told him Mary would be fine. The labor of it was grueling, piecing together a decade-old conspiracy in a dusty cave. They cross-referenced dates, matching a payroll robbery with the miraculous discovery of funds for a new town hall, a stolen cattle drive with the sudden expansion of a prominent citizen's ranch. The truth was a web of rot, and Silas Thorne was the spider at its center. He had orchestrated it all. Rose traced a finger over his name, appearing again and again. The man who had laughed at her, who had left her to die for a piece of paper, was far more monstrous than she had imagined. Eli looked at her in the dim, conspiratorial light of the lantern, the weight of their discovery settling on him. "This is more than revenge for your father's claim," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "This is a reckoning for the whole valley." The full, terrible scope of the secret revealed itself not in the cold numbers of the ledgers, but in the brittle, yellowed pages of the letters. They delved deeper, reading the private correspondence of the gang's leader, a man named Jedediah Kane. In a long, soul-bearing letter to a brother he would never see again, Kane laid the inhuman betrayal bare. The hidden discovery was not just a list of crimes, but a confession, a warning, and a testament. Thorne hadn't just been their fence. He had been their partner. He'd planned their final, most audacious job, the robbery of a government gold shipment. In exchange for the lion's share of the take and Kane's ledgers, the only evidence of his involvement, Thorne had promised the Red Rock Gang full pardons, new identities, and a clean start. It was the dream every outlaw chased. Kane had believed him. He described meeting Thorne on a moonless night, handing over the main ledgers and receiving the signed pardon papers. But the papers were forgeries. The promise was a lie. The next day, instead of a guide to lead them to safety, a posse arrived, a posse led by Sheriff Miller and Silas Thorne himself, who was hailed as a hero for leading the charge. The gang was slaughtered in a narrow pass, their bodies buried in unmarked graves. Thorne and his circle kept the government gold, claimed the bounty on the outlaws' heads, and buried the story, cementing their power and reputations on the graves of the men they had betrayed. The cash Rose had found was Kane's personal stash, a small portion of the gold he'd never trusted Thorne with, hidden away with his private letters and a duplicate damning ledger. It was his insurance, his final posthumous testimony. For Rose, the revelation was a lightning strike. Her father, he hadn't been a lucky prospector. He must have stumbled upon a clue, an old campsite, a dropped coin, a story from another old-timer that led him to suspect the truth about the land near the Devil's Jaw. His claim wasn't for worthless rock. It was for a place that held the key to Thorne's secret history. That was why Thorne had been so desperate, so brutal. It wasn't about land. It was about silence. For Eli, the truth was a personal poison. The doctor who had let Mary die had built his practice with outlaw gold. The sheriff who had offered his condolences had been Thorne's executioner. The entire structure of his world, the town he had once loved, was a monument to a decade-old massacre. Everything was a lie. Rose picked up the final letter, Kane's elegant script blurring before her eyes. It spoke of his hope for a new life, a wife, a small ranch, a life like the one Eli had lost. She looked at Eli, whose face was a mask of cold fury, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the rock. The silence in the cave was absolute, filled with the ghosts of murdered men. "He killed them all," Rose whispered, the words falling like stones into the quiet. "He killed them all to become a king on their ashes." The valley had grown uneasy. Rose Vale's disappearance was now a known fact, a grim story told in hushed tones. But the absence of a body was a loose thread, and it made Silas Thorne nervous. He sent his men out, not to search for a survivor, but to confirm a corpse. Cale, his best tracker, a man with the patience of a vulture, was assigned the Badlands. He found the tracks easily. 2 horses, 1 shod, 1 not, leading from the deep canyon toward the isolated Price Ranch, and then back again. He knew Price, a broken man who kept to himself. But this was an anomaly, and Cale did not like anomalies. As Rose and Eli carefully packed the ledgers and a sample of the gold into their saddlebags, the sky outside the canyon began to darken. The air grew heavy and still, the oppressive silence before a storm. By the time they were ready to leave the cave, the first fat drops of rain were splattering against the rocks, and a low rumble of thunder echoed off the canyon walls. Within minutes, the sky opened. A classic Arizona monsoon, violent and sudden, turned the canyon floor into a raging river of red-brown water. They were trapped. The roar of the flash flood was deafening. Just as the storm reached its peak, a figure appeared at the mouth of the passage, silhouetted by a flash of lightning. It was Cale. Water streamed from the brim of his hat. His eyes, cold and assessing, took in the scene in an instant. The open chests, the saddlebags, Eli's rifle, and Rose. He saw Rose, and he smiled, a thin, cruel slash in his gaunt face. "Boss was right to be worried," he drawled, his hand moving toward the pistol at his hip. "Figured we'd find you in a hole somewhere." The standoff was short and brutal. There was no room for a clean fight. As Cale drew his gun, Eli lunged, not at the man, but at the lantern, plunging the cave into absolute darkness, broken only by strobing lightning. The shot went wide, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating Cale's snarling face. It became a desperate, clumsy brawl in the dark. Eli, using his raw rancher's strength, grappled with Cale, the two men crashing against the rock walls. Rose, her heart pounding, grabbed the heaviest thing she could find, a small, solid ingot of gold, and swung it blindly in the direction of the fight. It connected with a sickening thud. Cale grunted and fell, his pistol clattering to the floor. The crisis had come and passed in a blur of violence. They had crossed the line. There was no going back now. They had fought for the secret, and now it owned them completely. They bound Cale with leather straps, his unconsciousness a temporary reprieve. As the storm slowly grumbled its way east, the floodwaters receded, leaving the canyon glistening and washed clean. In the grey light of dawn, Eli and Rose stood at the entrance to the cave, looking out at the transformed world. The air was cool and clean. Behind them, their prisoner was beginning to stir. They had the ledgers, the gold, and now a living witness. The choice had been made for them. The ride east was grim and determined. They bypassed redemption completely, skirting the town under the cover of the pre-dawn light. Cale, bound and gagged, was slung over the mare, his hateful glare promising retribution. Rose and Eli rode in silence. The tin box containing the valley's dark heart nestled securely in Eli's saddlebag. They pushed on for 2 days, stopping only to rest the horses, their faces set with a grim resolve. They weren't just fugitives anymore. They were messengers carrying a truth heavy enough to shatter a community. They arrived in Prescott, the territorial capital, looking like what they were, exhausted, trail-worn, and desperate. They went directly to the office of the U.S. Marshal, a man named Sterling, whose reputation for unbending integrity was known throughout the territory. Marshal Sterling was a tall, severe-looking man with eyes that seemed to see right through to a man's soul. He listened to their story without interruption, his expression unreadable. When they finished, he gestured to the tin box. Rose placed it on his desk. He opened it, his long fingers carefully turning the pages of the ledgers. He read Kane's final letter, his face remaining a mask of professional calm. The kind professional, a young clerk from the marshal's office, was called in. He examined the paper, the ink, the bindings. The ledger books are consistent with the period, Marshal. The clerk confirmed quietly, his voice filled with a gentle awe. The ink is iron gall. This is authentic. Sterling then turned his attention to Cale, who had been held in a back room. Faced with the ledgers and the marshal's implacable stare, Cale's bravado crumbled. He confessed everything, confirming the story and implicating Thorne in Rose's attempted murder. The vindication was quiet, methodical, and absolute. Sterling deputized Eli on the spot, a silent acknowledgement of the man's character. He gathered a posse of his own trusted deputies, and they rode back toward redemption. When the federal lawmen rode down the town's main street, a wave of confusion and fear rippled through the populace. This was not local justice. This was something else entirely. The arrests were swift and silent. Thorne was taken from his office, his face a mask of disbelief. Sheriff Miller, was disarmed behind his own desk. The doctor was led from his surgery, still wiping his hands on a cloth. One by one, the founding fathers of Redemption's prosperity were revealed as frauds and criminals. The townspeople, the chorus that had once laughed with Thorn at the lone woman with a worthless claim, now watched in stunned silence. As Thorn was led in chains toward a prison wagon, he saw Rose standing with Eli across the street. For a moment, their eyes met. The mockery was gone from his face, replaced by a hollow, gaping comprehension. I was not just defeated, he was undone. His legacy erased by the woman he had tried to erase. The town's memory of itself began to fracture, preparing to be rewritten. Months passed. The valley breathed again. The hard winter gave way to a spring so vibrant, it felt like a promise fulfilled. The air, once thick with unspoken fear, was now clear and light. On the plot of land her father had left her, the one Thorn had declared barren rock, a cabin was taking shape. The scent of fresh-cut pine mingled with the sweet smell of desert sage blooming after the rains. The cabin was simple and sturdy, its foundation solid, its walls true. It was being built beside the mouth of the hidden spring, the deep water the old prospector had spoken of, which now irrigated a small, flourishing garden. Rose worked alongside Eli, her hands, once soft, now calloused and capable. There was a peaceful rhythm to their shared labor. The steady tap of a hammer, the rasp of a saw. Eli's face, which had been a tight mask of grief when she first met him, had softened. The deep lines of sorrow around his eyes were still there, but now they were joined by new lines etched by quiet smiles. Gideon, the old horse, grazed nearby, a silent, watchful companion to their new beginning. One late afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in strokes of amber and rose, Eli paused, leaning on his hammer. He gestured with his chin toward the distant lights of Redemption, already twinkling in the valley below. They used the gold from the red rock cache, he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. The government's share they recovered, it's going to build a proper schoolhouse and hire a new doctor from back east. Rose nodded, her gaze sweeping over the small world they were building. The solid cabin, the clean water bubbling from the earth, the green shoots in her garden. This was real. This was hers. Eli looked at her, a question he seemed to have been holding for a long time finally surfacing. That part of the cache that was yours, he said quietly. Cain's personal gold. It was a fortune, Rose. You could have left this place, built a mansion somewhere else, forgotten all of this. Rose looked down at her own hands, at the strength and purpose they had found. She looked at the home they were raising from the ground, a testament not to a treasure discovered, but to a life earned. She met his gaze, her own eyes clear and calm. The gold wasn't the treasure, she said, her voice soft but certain, carrying the entire weight of her journey. It was just the key. This is the treasure. She smiled, a real unguarded smile, and in the golden light they went back to work, building their future, one nail at a time. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this story of courage and quiet vindication. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength is found in the things and the people that the world has written off. A story of how a truth buried in the stone can set a whole valley free. If you were moved by Rose and Eli's journey, We'd be honored if you'd leave a like and tell us in the comments what part of their story resonated with you most. Be sure to subscribe for more Tales of the Forgotten Frontier. We'll see you next time.